For the second night in a row, the beam is lit. And for the second night in a row, the Kings just took care of business against a weaker Western Conference opponent. They just came out and did exactly what they needed to do to get back to 500. Those first two games, they played well, got a little unlucky, they stayed the course. Next two games, they get wins. And they did what everyone's been asking for, which is to take care of these types of matchups where you're against worse teams. Both teams were on the second night of a back-to-back. The Kings are in Utah. Utah, is a little shorthanded, and they got more shorthanded as the game went on with Markkanen not coming back for the second half. And another thing they did for the second night in a row is keep their opponent under 100 points. So not only are they scoring 113 points, and the offense was looking very good. I mean, they were just picking apart the Jazz so easily, but they also hold the Jazz to 96 points. Neither team shot well from three. I think both teams kind of missed a lot of opportunities. The Kings in transition offensively weren't very good, and they also just had moments where they had passes that seemed like we're going to lead to buckets, and then the guy would just drop them, or something weird would happen, or they just made the wrong decision. Jazz, the same thing, where they got some transition opportunities. They were running to the corners, and the Kings weren't getting back in transition, and they missed some shots. But despite those missed opportunities for the Kings, they held the lead for almost the entirety of the game, if not the entirety of the game. It wasn't the prettiest of starts. The Kings' defense was horrible. Like, they were not awake. This was not good offense from the Jazz. It wasn't the Kings having to, pay attention to a star player or something so others get open. It was just some poor defense to start this game from the Kings, just some laziness, not being locked in, and they allowed a lot of open threes. And the Jazz came out, knocked down some threes. Luckily, the Kings offense was playing really well, and like I said before, picking the Jazz apart. Like, that was never going to be a problem. They were always going to be able to score. And it was just, could they turn up the defense for certain portions of this game to be able to pull away? And so the string that Mike Brown pulled was going to a zone. And I don't know if I've ever seen a zone be this effective for the Kings for as long of a stretch as it was. Because the Kings were just having problems guarding the corners. They were also, the Jazz had multiple wide open drives down the lane. And so they had to switch it up, went zone, and it worked out perfectly. They were super connected, and the Jazz just couldn't figure it out. They got a few good looks to John Collins inside, but he couldn't convert them. And when he was going up against Sabonis, he's not going to win that 1v1 matchup. You're not going to outmuscle Sabonis inside, so Collins had to take those mid-range jumpers, which didn't look good, at least early in the game for him. And the Kings were just kind of able to blow open a pretty big lead from there. Utah pretty much did the same thing, where they went to a zone as well. The Kings weren't really able to knock down their shots, and so it was kind of the same on both ends for a bit there. But the difference was the Kings having Domantas Sabonis, who could just walk into the lane and score. He had 28 points, 13 for 18 from the field. His finishing inside these first four games has been incredible. He doesn't miss inside so far. Also another game where he goes 1 for 2 from three. But he was absolutely the difference when it came to the offenses, because neither offense was really knocking down their shots, and the Kings could just throw it into Sabonis, get a mismatch, get whatever they wanted. Of course, it wasn't just Sabonis. Like Fox, if Fox had a rough time shooting the ball from outside, and when I mean outside, I just mean outside the paint. Like, he went 1 for 2 from three, which is fine. But it felt like his jumper just wasn't totally going down, but he was just doing everything else so well. His passing was really good. He made multiple great interior passes. He was getting kind of wherever he wanted on the court, pulling the defense apart, finishing at the rim. And Utah just, their defense looked awful. Like, let's be honest about this. The only time they got a stop was when the Kings were missing an open three, or if Walker Kessler was able to block a shot. Like, that was about it. But I'm just really happy that the Kings took advantage of a very obviously, like, not a good defensive team in the Utah Jazz. I mean, they're just small without Taylor Hendricks, and then obviously without Markkanen in the second half. I mean, they're playing Keontae George, Jordan Clarkson, Colin Sexton, Patty Mills. Like Colin Sexton, he's a tenacious defender, but when he's matched up against DeMar DeRozan's just going to shoot right over him. So the matchups really favored the Kings, and this Kings offense just looks so lethal because they can score in so many different ways. And so that's what I loved about it, how the three-point shot wasn't always falling, but it felt like they just kept trying different things. Like they would try one thing to get a guy open from three, and then they would try another thing to get DeRozan the ball, in the post against a smaller defender, and then they would try another thing to get Fox, off ball, get him around a screen, get him to his left hand going downhill. Then they would get Sabonis in the post. Like they just have so many different options that we saw them utilize in this game, which was fun. We saw a lineup change in this game. Last game against Portland, in the fourth quarter, the Kings went to Lyles at the small ball five. It worked well. They went back to it in this game. We didn't see Len until garbage time. So they were playing Lyles at the five. I felt like when he was at the middle of the zone defensively, the Kings defense was just not as good as it was when Sabonis was there. And that makes sense. Obviously, Lyles is not the defender that Sabonis is at the middle of that zone. It felt like Lyles was kind of getting bullied even when they went back to man. But he did have one possession where he got like 2 blocks. And what he did well was when the Jazz players would drive, he was getting strips on the ball. And that's where he can be effective defensively because he's not obviously going to be some shot blocker. And so the Kings kind of have to rely on being a little scrappier defensively when they're smaller without a shot blocker and Alex Len. And I thought the bench was super scrappy with Lyles. I mean, he had 2 steals, 2 blocks. Keon Ellis had 2 steals, 3 blocks. The Kings were able to get out in transition. Their problem, especially in the second quarter, was not being able to finish in transition. And the Kings, they let the Jazz back into the game in that second quarter because of too many careless turnovers and then not getting back in transition. The Jazz were just generating way too many open corner threes because of those careless turnovers from the Kings. And it felt like at halftime, with maybe a few minutes to go in the half, it felt like it could kind of go either way because both teams were getting opportunities and it was kind of a wild game, fast paced, but it was the Kings who ended up on top. They had some really great ball movement to end that second quarter, tightened up a bit defensively. Keon Ellis with that bench unit was so important because he was able to kickstart the offense in transition. Because I feel like with those bench units, when Trey Lyles is out there, when Keon's out there with like Fox, the offense can be a little harder to come by at times. So it's important that Keon was able to make that impact so they could get some easy buckets in transition. He had that really nice putback after Fox missed the layup, and the Kings got it up to 9 at halftime. They came out of half, allowed 2 open threes from the Jazz. Not a good start, but then from there, they just kind of slowly increased the lead. Point by point, they couldn't quite convert in transition, which is why it was a bit slower than maybe it needed to be. But again, like I said, it was just the Kings picking the Jazz defense apart. And I mean, the Jazz, they honestly looked like they stopped trying in that third quarter. The Kings only allowed 14 points in the third quarter. I mean, the Jazz were just chucking up the worst shots. They couldn't throw the ball into the ocean. Markkanen didn't come back for the second half, and it felt like that just completely killed the Jazz's will in this one. I mean, it was kind of sad. And so it's like, I think you do give credit to the Kings defensively, right? But you have to understand that this Jazz team just looked awful. But we've seen plenty of times, in the past, like last year, we've talked about it a ton, where the Kings let teams like the Jazz have huge offensive nights. This was not that for them. I mean, some of it was just the shooting luck. There's no doubt some of that shooting luck coming back for the Kings after the first 2 games. But then, once the Jazz kind of capitulated, it was just steal after steal, strip after strip. And the Kings were just fully locking them up defensively. They got up 24 in the third quarter, and then they just repeatedly in the fourth quarter. They had an awful start to the fourth quarter defensively, or, well, no, offensively, sorry, where they were just standing around. I mean, defensively too, where they just looked lazy. They looked like, the game's over. But we saw it against Portland too, where it's like they just eased off a little too early. It's like you got to keep going so that we can get the bench in here so they don't, make a fake comeback and then you have to keep your starters in. And so the way the Kings combated that is just give the ball to DeMar DeRozan with smaller guys on him, and he just picked the Jazz apart. And that's what I love about this DeMar DeRozan edition is that he just adds something that the Kings didn't have before, where in these situations where you have a lead, and it could be smaller than this. Obviously, this is an example where it wasn't necessary to have a guy like DeRozan. But there are going to be times in the future where the Kings have a lead, but it's, the other team could actually come back. And you need to, not be a super fast offense. But the Kings didn't have that gear before. And it led to a lot of turnovers. It led to some really bad shots last season. Obviously, the Phoenix game is the one that sticks in my mind where, I mean, the Kings just couldn't do anything offensively because they were trying to slow it down, but then at the same time, you still have to score, and they weren't getting good shots. And so in this game, you're just able to throw to DeRozan and get good offense that way. And he had his fourth consecutive 20-point game to start the season. It wasn't a game where we got to the free throw line much. 9 for 14 from the free throw line. Hopefully the percentages there, are not indicative of the Kings coming back to earth, from the free throw line. But it just wasn't one of those games. It was the opposite of the Portland game, where the Portland game, at least in the first half, was so slow and, foul after foul. This one was just wide open, super fast pace. Guys were getting shots up while there were still a few guys in the backcourt. It was that type of game. But it was just a no contest in the second half. And that's what we love to see. I already talked about Sabonis, obviously, dominant. Already talked mostly about DeRozan, but he had 8 assists, which we love to see from him. He also continues to be someone who's a very good off-ball defender, getting deflections, stripping the ball. The Kings as a whole just did a great job of when they, went to help on drives, they were constantly stripping the ball. Kevin Huerter, 2 steals, 1 block. Everyone in the starting lineup had at least 1 steal outside Sabonis. Keon, 2 steals. Trey, 2 steals. Like 9 combined blocks. There's just honestly not that much to talk about from this game because the Kings just handled business so easily. I think what we saw was just that this Kings offense has so many different weapons. Like you have Keegan Murray going 6 for 14. He didn't shoot that well, but he was always there to score when we needed him. And that's what it felt like. It felt like whenever certain guys would kind of, not be able to score, then it's like there was just somebody else to pick it up. And, everyone kind of contributed equally. Herter looked really good again. I mean, he was hitting shots from the mid-range, hitting shots from deep. He was bodying guys inside and then finishing a really tough finish with his left hand. That was very nice. And he was, again, getting in passing lanes. I think Trey Lyles is still getting his feet under him a little bit. Like he's still getting into the flow of it. But 7 rebounds after he had 0 rebounds in the last one. He was much better on the glass today. So credit to him for that. Missed an alley-oop dunk, which wasn't great. I still feel like he can... I think he can be better defensively than he has been. He's not going to be some great defender. I think he can be better defensively. I know he can be better offensively. And I'm saying that after you got 4 combined steals and blocks. But I think just one-on-one, he can be better defensively. Malik had an off game, shooting from the field. And then Keon Ellis. Keon, very good defensive game. But the one thing for him, like he just had a poor offensive game. And it wasn't because, he shot super poorly. He was 2 for 4 from the field, 0 for 2 from 3. It's that he wasn't shooting. And I think that really shows why he's not the starter. Like he's got to be able to shoot when he's open. He passed up open shots. He's got to be something offensively in the half court offense. And, he generated fast break looks. That's great. But if he wants to be a starter or get a bunch of minutes, off the bench. He has to be better offensively. He has to be more of a threat from deep. He can't pass up those shots. He's got to find other ways to score as well. I think the one worrying thing we saw from this game was the 3-point defense. The Jazz shot horribly. You know, they missed open looks, and especially in the first half. Some of it was in transition. That's kind of a different issue where you just can't be turning the ball over when you're in transition, because that's just always going to lead to open looks the other way. But it's when it was in the half court. I think the start of the game was just not being locked in, but you know, you have to be locked in when you play better teams, even when you play teams like the Jazz. We just kind of got lucky early on. And then the zone was good for a bit, and then they figured it out. And that's kind of how it goes with zones a lot in the NBA, is they work a little bit because they throw the other team off and then they figure it out. So then they started getting some open looks, and so we had to switch back to man to man. And so I think this was actually probably the Kings' worst game so far this season when it came to defending the 3-point line, even though they only allowed 96 points and the Jazz didn't shoot well. And I say that because I think you can look at the Minnesota game and they got some open looks, but I think it was just because Minnesota's a better offense. The Kings had to put way more attention on Anthony Edwards. That wasn't the case in this game. And so it's definitely something the Kings need to clean up, where it didn't even feel like the Jazz were putting that much pressure on the defense and they were still allowing open threes. I haven't had a problem with the 3-point defense in any of the other 3 games, really. We all know that this team has so much potential offensively, but I do think they have underrated potential defensively as well. Just because if you've been watching the team the last couple of seasons, you've seen the defensive improvements, especially from 2 seasons ago to last season. There was improvements, and I think you're seeing this team improve even more. I think not playing Harrison Barnes 40 minutes a night is just right there a big improvement to the defense. You know, no offense to HB, but it's just the truth. And the starting lineup has been very solid defensively, and then you have Keon Ellis coming off the bench, who can be just an absolute menace defensively, of course. And then if you need a shot blocker, you have Alex Len. I am very interested in when Orlando Robinson comes back, because you know, Alex Len isn't guaranteed minutes. He's a known quantity, but I'm really interested to see like if Orlando Robinson gets any run. You know, if he gets opportunities over Alex Len. We probably are like 2 to 3 weeks away from his reevaluation, but that could add another, you know, defensive anchor to the group if he can be something of a rotation player. And then you have Devin Carter coming back, and I think that's really the guy who can make a big impact here. Just really good signs early from this team, and they got back to 500. Obviously, a lot of things can change. It's a small sample size for everything. This was the start of a 4-game road trip. They now head to Atlanta. Then they have Toronto on the second night of a back-to-back. And then they go to Miami. And then they also come back home and play Toronto. And I said before this 6-game stretch, I wanted 4 to 5 wins. So far, they already got 2, so a very good start. In this upcoming game against the Atlanta Hawks, we get to see the number 1 overall pick, Zachary Ricochet. Now, the Hawks, they're a scary team to me, just because they have Dyson Daniels. And we know what Dyson Daniels did to the Kings last season on the Pelicans. He is a menace defensively. Fox just could never do anything against him. But the good thing now is he's, you know, Dyson, he's a little more isolated on this Atlanta team. So, you know, the Kings can go to other guys to take advantage of the Hawks defense. The Hawks haven't had a tough schedule up to this point, but they're also 500. They play, I believe it's Cleveland tomorrow, and then they get 1 day rest before the game. So we'll be on a little more rest than them. And obviously they have Trae Young, but the main guy you really got to watch out for with this Hawks team is Jalen Johnson. He's a physical beast. He's a guy that can go get you a triple-double, and I assume it's going to be Keegan who gets that matchup. So it's going to be really important for Keegan to obviously not let him get downhill. Also keep him off the offensive glass. I'm confident in the Kings, you know, guards' abilities to defend a guy like Trae Young. You know, Fox, Keon. I'm confident in that. Fox didn't have the best defensive game here against the Jazz. I felt like he had one of his games where he's just constantly gambling, and he gambled wrong a lot. And I feel like that's just kind of the way he plays. So sometimes it's really good, sometimes it's really bad. but I'm pretty confident in his ability to guard Trae Young. And then the Hawks, I mean, they're pretty beat up as well, so they don't have a whole bunch of depth. So this is a game that the Kings should be able to win. Also, the Hawks, they're playing Washington next, not Cleveland. They just lost to Washington too. Anyways, that is it for this episode of the Roll Report. If you made it this far, make sure to like, comment, subscribe as always. Shout out to the members of this channel, No Rain and Joe Mama. And I will see you guys after the game against Atlanta on Friday. Peace.